All right, assalamu alaikum. Assalamu
Assalamu
alaikum to those of you joining us.
Assalamu alaikum. Can you hear me?
Wa alaikum salam. Yes, we can hear you. We can hear you, mashallah. All
Sahib
right.
Abdel Malik.
Assalamu alaikum.
How are you?
Alhamdulillah, how you doing, man?
Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah. Good to see you, boy.
I think my
you
brother.
weren't that excited when you saw me, Imam. I'm just kidding.
I think my brother met you before. He's told me a lot about you.
You look familiar. Who's your brother?
His name is Abdurrahman Haikal. I think like 2 years ago, you guys were in a retreat together, and he
Oh,
drove you.
where? Where?
I, I'm not sure.
Ah, yeah. I remember him. How's he doing, man?
He's doing well, alhamdulillah.
Give him my salams, man.
I will. I definitely will.
Inshallah. Inshallah.
All right, inshallah. For the sake of time, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I want to remind everyone, inshallah, that this is going to be recorded, but only those who are like speaking will be in the actual I don't know, broadcast or whatever you want to call it, inshallah. Okay, so as always, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. ثم أما بعد, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh to everyone here, all whopping 10 of you, mashallah. What we are going to do, as always, is begin in the name and remembrance of Allah Azza wa Jal, and really situate the series within the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, particularly the end of Surah Saba, ayahs 46 to 49. We have with us, inshallah, Abdullah Haykal, mashallah, a wonderful qari of our community, as well as a med student based in Michigan. And we ask all of you here to make dua for him and his studies, inshallah. And with that, we're going to go ahead and get started.
Thank you.
Abdullah.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. قل إنما أعظكم بواحدة أن تقوموا لله مثنى وفرادا ثم تتفكروا ما بصاحبكم من جنة إن هو إلا نذير لكم بين يدي عذاب شديد قل ما سألتكم من أجر فهو لكم إن أجري إلا على الله وهو على كل شيء شهيد قل إن ربي يقذف بالحق علام الغيوب قل جاء الحق وما يبدئ الباطل وما يعيد صدق الله العظيم.
Sadaqallah al-Azim. Jazakallah khairan, Abdullah. We have with us Rufayda Rakha, who will be reading the translation.
Say, O Prophet, I advise you to do only one thing. Stand up for the sake of Allah, individually or in pairs, then reflect. Your fellow man is not insane. He is only a warner to you before the coming of a severe punishment. Say, if I had ever asked you for a reward, you could keep it. My reward is only from Allah, and He is a witness over all things. Say, surely my Lord hurls the truth against falsehood. He is the knower of all unseen. Say, the truth has come, and falsehood will vanish, never to return.
Sadaqallah al-Azim. And we're going to think through and along these ayahs, inshallah, throughout the series. I actually want to share my screen so that, let's see, one second. So that we can, sorry. So inshallah, I don't know why I'm not able to share my screen. If Brother Tariq, if you are able to share your screen, I'm going to share this presentation with you. But essentially, while we do that, I just wanted to say that these ayat were actually pulled from a letter that went around in May 2020 that was written by our Imam Jamil Amin, who, as many of you know, is a prisoner and subject to, unfortunately, the myth of freedom of speech. He's actually been incarcerated for decades, and recently there's been a reevaluation of his trial, and he wrote this beautiful letter that I really feel encapsulates, really, it touches upon what we want to try to discuss throughout the series, inshallah, and begin with our conversation with Imam Abdul Malik Ali today. And I'm just going to read it, inshallah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Compassionate. Blessed are those who struggle. Oppression is worse than the grave. It is better to die for a noble cause than to live and die a slave. There are no new answers to old problems. Tyranny and oppression is worse than slaughter, so fight them wherever you may find them. Common struggle is not sufficient. We have to begin to be conscious in our struggle. Allah does not change the condition of a people until they change that which is within themselves. قُلْ جَاءَ الْحَقُّ وَمَا يُبْدِئُ الْبَاطِلُ وَمَا يُعِيدُ. Say the truth has arrived, and falsehood neither creates anything new nor restores anything. Truth smashes the brains out of falsehood. Truth comes and falsehood is vanquished, for falsehood by its nature is bound to perish. We live in a land that has said that freedom is the pinnacle of its moral argument, that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, its banner of moral authority, that there is free speech, but I am still gagged and prevented from declaring my innocence. They speak to me of religious freedom, but I am not allowed to pray according to my faith. Like the Panther 21, incarcerated unjustly to discredit a movement, like those Panthers still behind bars after decades, there's no freedom and morality from those in power remains a myth. They say they guarantee liberty, but not for the ex-slave and Native American. Their pursuit of happiness is always at the expense of the poor. Can you see? Justice and law march to two different drummers, two totally different conversations. Now the rights you thought you had will be taken away. Hugh Long, former governor of Louisiana, was asked, will fascism come to America? He replied, yes, but it will be called patriotism. Shepherds may change, but sheep will always remain the same. Empires rise and fall. Worldly powers can and do defy right, and misused intelligence may obscure Allah's light. But Allah in His good time separates good from evil. I believe both by certain faith and by intuition that there is no power and no might except with Allah, the High, the Mighty. I pray that Allah the Almighty will number me among those whom He has chosen and elected, whom He has led to the truth and guided, whom He has inspired to remember Him and not forget Him, whom He has preserved from the evil in themselves so that they do not prefer anything to Him, and whom He has made His own so that I serve only Him, and that He gives the grace to lead the righteous. Assalamu alaikum, Allah's slave, Ramadan Kareem, Imam Jamil al-Amin. So the reason why I thought it was very important, oh sorry, people in the waiting room, is very important because first of all, everyone here, inshallah, if we can pray for Imam Jamil, it means freedom, and all those that have been unjustly incarcerated, specifically because it is the embedded, the prison system is embedded in the structural fight, right, against injustice. And inshallah, for this series, what we are trying to do is we want to connect the sort of the history of the Black Power movement, tracing back to the 50s and sort of the beginnings of the civil rights movement, and the political upheaval that that soon just continued to obviously mark the Black struggle in America. I mean, even in the 60s, really a decade of actually not even, I mean, afterwards as well, a time of political upheaval. We have, for example, as we discussed in our last series, in 65, you have the assassination of Malcolm, and then you have the assassination of Robert Kennedy, of course, Martin Luther King in 68, and then Fred Hampton, right, in 69. So in general, all these iconic figures that were leaders of the movement, and you know, their assassinations, and really trying to understand the relationship between the struggle, not simply within sort of understanding the contours of the movements like themselves, but also in relation to the state and what was suppressed. What are you allowed to say? What are you not allowed to say? What forms of the movement are characterized as, like, now in retrospect, as like sort of like super cool and sort of appeal to the values of this country, and, you know, the story or this narrative of overcoming in the Black community. But we see that this the chains now are physically different, right? They're in institutions, but they have not necessarily been removed. When we look at structurally, again, the system of incarceration, of urban segregation, of poverty, of you know, what resources the Black community has access to and what they don't, and specifically the responses of the state to moments of you know, what some will call revolution, but you know, in the case, for example, of our present moment, right, from our vantage point of the present, in the case of the demonstrations in response to George Floyd, you know, we have to be very vigilant and deliberate about how we talk about it and continue the actual movement, because very quickly there is a whitewashing, you know, in history of important movements. And so this series is really us attempting to trace that history and to retell the stories and formations of these social movements that you know, have characterized the Black Power movement until today, and you know, the important figures that we need to really know the stories of, and sort of the constellation of different events and figures as they all relate to each other, inshallah. And as Muslims, as Imam Jamil reminds us, really situating the struggle as one of overcoming al-batil, you know, of recognizing the modern pharaohs in our modern time. And you know, the pharaohs in empire take the form of structures as well as figures and people. So with that, inshallah, what I wanted to do is I wanted to have Imam Abdel Malik Ali begin the conversation for our series for this month, which is to look at this history and to look at the protests, not in abstract, like platitudinous ways, you know, but really from a strategy perspective, you know, what worked, what didn't work, you know, looking back, you know, a couple months later in retrospect, you know, how were the demonstrations, you know, liberalized or attempted to be liberalized, and if so, does that affect really the potency of these you know, modern organic disruptions of you know, the status quo, which is required when we think about revolution. So inshallah, I'm going to turn it over to Imam Abdel Malik, and then inshallah at the end of today, I want to recap what we have in store for the next 4 weeks, inshallah. Jazakumullah khairan. I want to just ask Imam the first overarching question, which is to begin by situating us with your reflections on the George Floyd protests afterwards, and as they relate to Imam Jamil Amin's letter. Jazakallah khairan.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. There were those of us, Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. It's an honor really to be here. Good to see familiar faces. There are those of us who were saying a few years ago that the 2020s could make the 60s look like a dress rehearsal. And part of the reason had to do with this cycle in terms of the Black liberation struggle. If you start from 1920s and you go 40 years from there was the 1960s. Then if you start from 1980, 40 years from there is 2020. We say 1980 because 1980 was like a mini 60s. The early 80s was like a mini 60s. And we had our own Donald Trump in the form of Ronald Reagan. And so the children of the 60s, those of us who were literally children of the 60s, we had entered into our early 20s in the 1980s. And so having seen what we saw with the Black Panthers and the whole the Black liberation struggle that we saw and was shaped by coming up, by the early 80s, we were ready to get busy. So 40 years from that is 2020. And so, so many of us felt, as I said, that 2020s was going to be a serious decade, not just a serious year, but a very, very serious decade for the United States and for the world. What happened with George Floyd is very important to, and the response to that was something that the racist police did not anticipate. One of the things that we're dealing with, it's an age-old problem, and we saw it on January 6th, the police forces across this country are infiltrated by the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, and the Nazis. I mean, every police department in this country. And we saw it on January 6th with the state capitol, right? Now, the system is, they have to deal with it. They really have to deal with it, right? Because now they're thinking that, which is very interesting, that they always felt that it was Black people who were the ones, and other victims of white supremacy, who were the ones that they had to be very cautious of, that they would at some point in time stand up and resist, and in so doing, bring down the system. But what they saw on January 6th, what is not necessarily the victims of white supremacy, the perpetrators of white supremacy, the victims of white supremacy who would do it, but actually the perpetrators of white supremacy who could bring the system down. They never anticipated that. They never anticipated that. So when this officer did what he did to George Floyd, they've gotten really bold, and they haven't seen Black rage in a long time. And so he got bold. And so, so there he was, killing this brother. And the response for African Americans, from Black people, the waking up of Black folks, but not just Black folks, it went across racial lines. You know what I'm saying? Because what he had forgotten, remember when when Donald Trump came in, the presidency, remember that? Remember when he instituted the ban? Remember how many white folks came out in support of us? And they shut down airports all across this country in support of us, the Muslims, right? So there is something in the air where when people who are standing up against oppression, there are many white people who will stand with the oppressed. And so not only did Black folks start standing up, but white folks started standing up, and not only nationally, but internationally, all over Europe, all over the African continent, and so on and so forth. They didn't anticipate this. They didn't anticipate this at all. And so it was a very beautiful response. It was a very beautiful response on the part of the people. Now, of course, the issue is sustaining such a resistance. That's always an issue. And that's coming. You know what I'm saying? Like, inshallah, it's like you don't know what spark is gonna cause the flame. You just don't know what spark. And so we've been getting different sparks, with the police assassinations, the police terrorism, and then with George Floyd, it just took it to a whole nother level. Now, of course, there'll be attempts to try to take the militancy out of it. But there were some very beautiful things that occurred. And we have to connect the George Floyd uprisings with Ferguson. Ferguson has to be studied because Ferguson was a template of how things should be done today. In Ferguson, the brothers and sisters in Ferguson actually disarmed a militarized police force. They disarmed them without arms. So when you had a situation where they were talking about hands up, don't shoot, but at the same time they were engaging in massive civil disobedience, Dr. King, massive civil disobedience, shutting everything down, right? While hands up, don't shoot. And you had this militarized police force, which was exposed, and you had the National Guard coming in with military equipment on people who were unarmed. That don't look right in a democracy. That don't look right. And so the governor of Missouri told them to stand down because it didn't look right. So Ferguson gave us a template as to how things should be done in this go round. And some of that was being used with the uprisings around George Floyd. It's not so much about tearing anything up or burning anything up. And although, of course, people are angry, you know what I'm saying? So we don't condone that, but we don't condemn it either. But the key is shutting everything down. Shutting down. If we look at Dr. King at the end of his life, and if you could find a book called The Trumpet of Conscience by Dr. King, when he does an interview with the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Company, and he talked about the importance of massive civil disobedience. So where Dr. King was at the end of his life, he still advocated nonviolence. But at the same time, he said nonviolence through massive civil disobedience. Dr. King was talking about shutting things down, shutting down freeways, shutting down transportation systems, shutting down airports. That's where Dr. King was at on a massive level, right? All over the country. That's where Dr. King was at. And when you saw these uprisings, that's exactly what the people were doing. They were engaging in massive civil disobedience. They were shutting things down. And it was beautiful. It was beautiful. The thing, of course, now, as we said, is sustaining it. How does one sustain a resistance? And I think, excuse me, studying the Southern Freedom Movement, the so-called Civil Rights Movement, is instructive because one of the things that has to happen for a movement to sustain itself is it has to be community-based. It has to be based in the community. It's got to be. Ferguson was a community, right? And so it's heartening to see this next generation are basically taking off where Martin and Malcolm left off. And this is key. This generation has to begin where Martin and Malcolm left off. And Ferguson, again, is instructive. So not only were they using massive civil disobedience, but some of the mothers of the victims of these police assassinations, some of the mothers came together and guess where they went to file a complaint? They went to the United Nations. That's Malcolm. That's Malcolm taking the United Nations taking the United States before the United Nations and accusing it, right, of genocide. You had African-American mothers who did that. So you see Black folks implementing strategies that come from where Martin and Malcolm were at the end of their lives. And that is extremely critical. And this is one of the reasons why there's an attempt to try to get us to steer away from Martin, late 60s Martin, to try to get us away from Malcolm at the towards the end of his life, because we check out what these men were saying. They were giving us a blueprint for today. You used the word empire, sister, and that's very important. That's the elephant in the living room. When people talk about why we still dealing with these problems, we're still dealing with these problems because America is still an empire. It's an empire. And there's no better definition of empire that you will see than in the Quran. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking through the mouth of Bilqis, And Bilqis is saying kings, when they enter into a social unit, or qaryatan, right? When they enter into a social unit, what do? They spread fasad. They spread corruption. So when imperial powers go into a country, they spread corruption. What's the first thing they do? Who are the first people they go after? The people of Izzah. Because the people of Izzah, who have this sense of honor, are not going to let someone come in and despoil their country, despoil their land. So they go after the people of Izzah to do what? Adillatin, to subdue them, to conquer them, right? So this is a perfect description of empire. And this is what America is doing. So America is still an empire. Now, America is a declining empire. Very important to keep that in mind. America is a declining empire, and America is truly desperate right now. And so one of the things that you see in a empire in decline is corruption, particularly from within, right? And right now, corruption is all around us in a form of injustice, immorality. It's corruption. It's corruption. And so America's going through there's some major changes coming to America, major changes coming to America. And instead of them, when I say them, I mean the corporatocracy, because it's the corporations who control the government. This is not a democracy. You can't be an empire and a democracy at the same time. That's impossible. That's part of the illusion. One of the ways that those who run this country engage in a social control is that they get the people to believe in illusions. And these illusions become, as I said, a form of social control. You can't be an empire and a democracy at the same time. That's impossible. You can't be a democracy and an oligarchy at the same time. Even Princeton University came out and said that. And so this is really important to deal with. So now, as America continues to go through its decline as an empire, you have Black folks who are standing up now. There's something happening among Black people. There's something major happening among Black folks in terms of an awakening that's occurring. And this is a good thing. And if there's something happening among Black folks, Islam is going to be a part of that. Because if you look at the so-called Black liberation struggle, some of the most powerful leaders in the Black liberation struggle, some of the most influential leaders in the Black liberation struggle have either been Muslim or in some way affiliated with Islam, associated with Islam. Marcus Garvey, right? Malcolm's parents were Garveyites, right? It's actually said not only was Garvey taught by a Muslim, do say Muhammad Ali, but it is also said that Garvey actually took Shahada, but he kept it on the DL because he was told that the people aren't ready for that. But he was taught by a Muslim. That's why he began his creed with the creed of Tawheed, one God, one aim, one destiny. Elijah Muhammad was a Garvey type leader associated with Islam. And of course, Muhammad Ali and Malcolm. So some of our most powerful, influential leaders were Muslims in the Black liberation struggle. And remember, it was the government who said, we must prevent the rise of a Messiah. Malcolm X might have been such a Messiah. He is the martyr of the movement today, a Muslim. All right. And so Islam is poised to play a major role in this next phase of the Black liberation struggle, a major role. And that's one of the reasons why Imam Jamil is in prison. And so this whole George Floyd assassination, it took the struggle to another level. It activated people, it mobilized people, but now we have to go to the level of organization, inshallah.
Inshallah. I wanted to actually follow up with something that you just said in terms of, Black Muslim leaders being very integral to the sustenance as well as the sort of like the galvanization of different parts of the movement. And we see, of course, just socially, the influence of that, the echoes of that until today. I wanted to ask you, why do you think the state was so afraid, particularly of Black Muslim leadership, and what we can learn from that in terms of how Black Muslim institutions and movements, and even just Black Muslim culture in general, as it permeates Black culture more broadly, is important for us to pay attention to.
They know their history. They know, for example, Christopher Columbus, when he came here, the first slave revolt in the so-called New World was on a plantation owned by Christopher Columbus's son. This was in the early 1500s. It was led by African Muslims. And so it was very common to have African uprisings led by Muslims, very common. It was so common that in the first 50 years of Spanish rule, there was 5 pieces of anti-Muslim legislation. Think about that. In the first 50 years of Spanish rule in the so-called New World, there was 5 pieces of anti-Muslim legislation. And the Wolof people were specifically named, right? So it was very common for African uprisings to be led by Muslims. It was very common for Africans to hook up with the indigenous people, the so-called Indians, to hook up with the indigenous people to fight against the West. Francois Mackendal was a leader in Haiti. He was a Muslim. Bookman, a man called Bookman, a man of the book, with book, the Quran. He was also a leader. He was from Jamaica, but he went to Haiti and fought there. Osceola, who was the chief of the Seminole Indians in Florida, one of his right-hand man was named Ibrahim. So they understand the history that as soon as Muslims were brought to the so-called New World, that the Muslims resisted. They resisted. And in places like Bahia in Brazil, like it was, they used Arabic as their war language because they knew that the slave owners didn't know Arabic. And so these people know this history. They know this history. And so their fear of this goes back to that. Now, let's come up to the early 1900s. A book by the name of called The Rising Tide of Color by Lathrop Stoddard. The Rising Tide of Color. Look that book up. He basically says in 1920, he basically says that our problem, when he said our, he's talking about the West and their plan to colonize Africa and Asia. He said our problem is going to be pan-Islamism, he called it. He said, because Islam is on the black man's land, Islam is on the brown man's land, Arabs, and Islam is on the yellow man's land, Asians. And he said, when they get a hold of Islam, he said they become more militant. This is all in the history. This is all in the history, okay? And so they understand the history. And so when Malcolm rises up, Allah raises him up, and he becomes a leader that inspires African Americans and inspires a resistance, that's a return to that legacy, African uprisings led by Muslims. So we saw it in the 1960s with Malcolm, but that goes way back. It goes further back, right? The Maroon societies in Cuba and Jamaica, where African slaves resisted and went up to the mountains, right? And set up communities there. It was very common for the Maroon societies to be headed by African Muslims. One brother even said, even to this day, there's one Maroon society in Jamaica where they still use the greeting, Assalamu alaikum. All right. So this history is known by them, and they understand what Islam does for us and how Islam can be used as a means for our liberation. They know that. They know that history. And this is, again, gets back to why Imam Jamil is in prison. They're afraid of African-American male Muslim leadership. They're afraid of it. And so there's a history to it. So that's why they're concerned. But if you notice, keep in mind that the only country in the West in which the majority of Muslims are converts is America. Think about that for a second. the only country in the West where the majority of Muslims are converts. And of those converts, the largest single group are African Americans. And so that's one of the ways that you can tell that African Americans are still African, that deep down inside, we're still Eastern, that from the outside, there's certain things that look Western. We give it a certain flavor, of course, but on the outside, there's certain things that look Western, but within, we're still an Eastern people. So you will see African Americans, very common, of course, African Americans who are not Muslims, who have Muslim names. Islam is a part of Black culture. In the hood, on the campuses, there's a tendency to think that Islam is just for Arabs and so on and so forth, that type of thing. But in the hood, in the deepest part of the hood, it's understood that Islam is a part of Black consciousness. And Islam is a part of the Black resistance.
Absolutely. I mean, even in terms of the cultural and art forms that have been produced, that relationship is very evident. It characterizes. I mean, I was living in Chicago actually last year, and you see. I mean, you'll walk down the street, 67th Street in the South Side, for example, and people will say, Assalamualaikum, like sister.
Exactly.
Yeah, and it's definitely embedded, and you see that culturally too.
It's Islam is the backstage pass in the hood.
Yeah,
it don't matter what gang territory that you walking in. If it's seen that you're a Muslim, that's your backstage pass, and they know that. And they know that. And of course, it was all in hip hop, right? I saw one article a while back, jihadists in the hood, right? This Islamophobe was talking about the fact that hip hop, so-called rap music, was spreading Islam. And I really don't think it's a coincidence that you saw a change in rap. The gay rapper, rise of the gay rapper, or Drake, right? Who says he can't wait to visit Israel and so on and so forth. You know what I'm saying? Because his mother's Jewish and so on and so forth. And so, and of course the whole gangster rap thing. So that was definitely by design. However, Islam is making another move again in terms of in the rap world.
Absolutely. And I did want to add to an earlier point that you mentioned in terms of, they know the history. And I think that's so important because one of the most important tools of resistance, and not, fetishized or rhetorical involvement in, the resistance, whether it's, as Fred Hampton called, like the Rainbow Coalition, having, non-Black folks that are also involved in expressing that solidarity and being consistent about it. But, I think what's really important is recognizing that history. It's very important for us. And,
it's critical.
And you need to know the cards in their hands and the cards in your hands. And it's really interesting. Actually, I only learned this last year. So the Haitian Revolution in like the ends of the 1700s, amidst a bunch of other slave revolts, were considered one of, if not the largest modern forms of organized revolt against, like a colony. It was specifically a French colony. And a lot of people were saying that a lot of a lot of the slaves that were organizing this were actually a Muslim. And then you have some, obviously, depending on their ancestral lineage, but they were saying like they would speak in Arabi or in whichever language. And
that's right.
And so it's actually very interesting because this history is so critical, but it's so far removed from the story today in terms of what Black struggle means and what it looks like. And which actually leads me to the next question, which is, why, or I'll sort of maybe preface the question first, why I think it's very important to make sure that we are very specific and very invested in this history, which again is really the point of this series, because you can't divorce the Black Lives Matter movement in its particular iteration today, right? Which a lot of people argue is becoming more and more secularized and liberalized, or whatever it may be. But you can't divorce that from a history of these different instances, or to like de-Islamicize is what
Right.
So I wanted to ask you in
Yeah.
terms of a lot of, I mean, I saw even specifically it's Black History Month. I saw a lot of Muslim and non-Muslim organizations that were really just cranking out, for example, programming that is, honoring the legacy of Black folks, whether it's within the Islamic tradition
Mm-hmm.
or not. The role of, sort of this like this dehistoricized idea of, okay, we
Right.
want to celebrate and uplift Black life, but we also want to do it in a way that's dehistoricized. And why do you think
Right.
it's important to not actually do that, but to actually understand the nuances of the different struggles, so we understand like where we are today and how we reach this? And as you said earlier, the recognition that this is just a new wave in an already existing and traceable
Yes.
movement that,
Yes.
like for Malcolm, for example, is an international one. It's not necessarily
Right.
only rooted in the United States. And that came from his understanding, again, of the political configuration of ummah, for example,
Yes.
the concept of
Yes.
ummah as a
Yes.
tool. So I
Yes.
wanted to ask you, I'm sorry, I used too many excessive words,
No,
but
no, no, no,
I just
no,
wanted
no, it's okay.
to ask you, why do you think it's important to make sure that there is a clear link when we talk about what's happening right now after George Floyd specifically,
Right.
to make sure that it is historicized and that it is,
Yeah.
within this knowledge that is very
Yeah.
important to have?
Because we can't link ourselves to the continuation of the struggle without knowing history. One of the ways to link ourselves to this struggle, right? A statement similar to what Frantz Fanon said, I kind of changed up a little bit, but each generation must find their historical mission and either fulfill it or betray it. Each generation must find their historical mission and either fulfill it or betray it. Every generation has a responsibility of helping us to get closer and closer to freedom. Every generation has that responsibility. So when there is someone in the current generation, when there are those in the current generation who are committed to being a part of the continuation of that struggle, what's extremely critical is knowing the history. In the midst of our work, in the midst of our activism, we have to know the history. In order for us to understand today, we have to understand what happened yesterday. And that's one of the problems with history teachers. By not doing that, history becomes irrelevant. Once we use history, once we use the past to understand the present, history becomes very relevant. And that's how we have to do it, because also history also gives us an identity, a purpose, and a direction. History gives us a blueprint. So we just don't say Quran and Sunnah, we say Quran, Sunnah, and Sirah, and the Sirah. You know what I'm saying? That we have to understand the history, you know what I'm saying, in order to link ourselves back up. And finally, one of the characteristics of a people who do not have a colonized mind is that they know their history. A people who have a colonized mind will not know their history. A free people, one of the characteristics of a free people is that they know their history. They know their history, and based on the knowledge of that history, they act upon that history. You know what I'm saying? If we look and see, for example, that self-determination, it's so key. And I want to talk about that in a minute in terms of Black self-determination, because this is what this is all about, Black self-determination. But for the Muslim, we could actually say that time began for us when we became self-determinate. Right? And so as soon as we had our own city-state, as soon as we had our own institutions, as soon as we had our own, and we were in control of our destiny, right? That's when time began for us. That's our calendar is based on that. You know what I'm saying? So all of this, so our history gives us an understanding of how we're supposed to proceed. So that means Muslims today, that if you want to see what Muslims are struggling for today, it's for self-rule. It's for self-determination. That's what we're struggling for, right? We're struggling against occupation, and we're struggling for self-rule, self-determination. For African Americans in this country, the Black liberation struggle, the essence of the Black liberation struggle is a struggle for Black self-determination. that we have a right for self-determination, to have our own institutions, right? And this is what's really, this is what's very critical. This country is set up in a way, not just nationally, but internationally as well. It's set up in a way to ensure that we do not become a self-determinant people. One of the things that's happening now is gentrification, which is a pretty way of saying ethnic cleansing. It's Chicago, right? So, you know what I'm saying? Detroit, all of the places that we had a large Black populations are being gentrified. One of the reasons that's for is because you can't be self-determinant without having your own land. You know what I'm saying? So part of that is designed, and one of our brothers actually told us that in US military intelligence, Black people are not allowed to be in one place for more than 3 generations. In this country, we're not allowed to be in one place for more than 3 generations, because that's one of the prerequisites of a self-determinate people. So our struggle is a struggle for self-determination, and confronting all of those forces that are trying to ensure that we never become a self-determinate people.
Yes, and I wanted to actually take that and actually you helped me segue into the next question, where Sam Greenlee, who is the author of The Spook Who Sat by the Door, a famous novel, as well as later became produced into a film, specifically about sort of actually this relationship, right, between the Black community and sort of with like the relation to the state, law enforcement, that kind of thing. But you know, he has a very important in an interview. I'm actually going to play a snippet of maybe today or maybe in another session, depending on time. But he emphasizes the notion of self-reliance, of building institutions, of in terms of having a sustainable community. That, I mean, the Black Panther Party demonstrated this, very well in terms of having hospitals and schools and providing breakfast for the people in the community, addressing imminent needs. And as long as these imminent needs exist, this idea of this like panned out social struggle, or rather the credibility of a movement, it will be weakened if again, that these needs are not necessarily tended to. And we actually later in this series, we have one of the films that we want to showcase or have a discussion about. It's called The Last Black Man in San Francisco, where we look specifically at that question of urban segregation, of gentrification, and that when we think about, okay, what are the issues structurally affecting the Black community, right? What are the inherently established roots of a lot of this oppression? And it takes the form of the shackles look different. I mean, even like you said, in terms of where people are able to live and what jobs they have access to. And Sam Greenlee, he actually has in this interview, he has a very important line where he says essentially that they used to own slaves, now they rent us. And this is in his words, where he's saying that even in terms of within this sort of this capitalist structure, in terms of the racial division of labor, and so all of that is interconnected. So to understand these eruptions that sort of bubble over and spill over in the streets, you have to understand, at least pay attention to all of these other issues that are affecting the community, and also recognize that there is a context of a movement of resistance, that these are not isolated incidents, that these are not just again, like independent spills of rage, that rage needs to be sustained, and that it is again situated within that history. Because we only have about 10 minutes, I really wanted to play that clip, but inshallah, we can bring you another time to specifically devote time to what leadership looks like. And I wanted us to actually look at the responses to George Floyd in terms of how different organizations responded and all of that. But I do want to make sure that I get to some of the questions here. There was a question I saw that said, I would like to know, your view about defunding the police?
Defunding the police, yes, yes. Defunding the police is connected also to cutting the military budget as well, right? Those are connected. So yes, I definitely think that the budget of the police should definitely be, they should take money from that. They should definitely defund the police, without a doubt. The police have been militarized. The first place they should defund the police at is to get them to disinvest in this military equipment. Why are you investing in military equipment for your police force? Because they know something is coming. The gap between the rich and the poor in this country is wider than it was during the Great Depression. And the gap is getting wider. Instead of them coming up with programs and economic policies that help to shrink the gap, the wealth gap, they're preparing prisons. They're preparing, because they know in any society, brothers and sisters, when you have an extremely wide wealth gap, that there's a social political explosion on the horizon. Any system, communist, capitalist, Islamic system, if there's a huge gap between the rich and the poor, you got a problem coming. Now, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us zakat and sadaqah to deal with that problem, to deal with that issue, right? What they're doing, instead of creating jobs, right? They are militarizing their police forces because they know something is coming. The people are working 2 and 3 jobs and not able to make ends meet, right? There are more billionaires in this country. There are more than there's ever been before. And so the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, the middle class is just almost getting wiped out. And they're dealing with it by militarizing the police, right? And so it's not going to work. It's not going to work. You know what I'm saying? And so this is where we're at right now. This is where we're at. And that's why it's so important, again, to listen to those who came before us, you know. Yeah. Very critical.
And I think underlying that question is a question of who gets that, you know, in terms of the monopoly on violence. And, you know, it's a question of why are there people in our society that have, you know, necessarily
and, you know,
access
sister, sister, it's not just about defunding the police. That's a part of it. But there's got to be a different philosophy of policing. I disagree when people say, get rid of the police altogether. That's not what we do. Because remember, we're builders of civilizations. We had police too. So we can base all this on how we did things. Our police did not try to put people in jail. We didn't build a society in which we can make the prisoners slaves. Remember the Constitution, Amendment 13, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except when used as a punishment for a crime. So according to the Constitution, you're allowed to use prisoners as slaves. And so we wouldn't necessarily say just get rid of the police altogether, but there's got to be a different philosophy of policing. You got to stop using the police as slave catchers. That's what they are, basically. They're slave catchers.
And it's internationally embedded too. And people say when people are talking about the Uyghur struggle in China, for example,
yes,
you know, the prisoners, those that are put either in concentration camps or again just different forms of incarceration and involuntary servitude, where they are forced to produce with, you know, without consent, essentially. So there is a relationship. I think it's important to recognize that the most militarized police in the world is right here. It's in the heart of this country.
It's in the heart of the empire.
Exactly.
And these cops are they have two things jumping off. They're full of hate. They're full of hate and they're full of fear. They fear us. They fear us and they hate us. And that comes out. And so there's got to be, you know, you got to go in there and you got to weed out. If this philosophy of policing is going to change, you got to weed out the KKK. You got to weed out the white supremacists. You got to weed out the Nazis. that are in these police organizations.
Right.
And we're not talking about that enough.
Yes, yes. Again, looking at the topography, looking at, okay, not just simply what, okay, let's look at these protests. What did they do wrong? Why did they do? But looking at it in relation to what, in response to what, chronologically, intergenerational violence, power differentials in terms of what the
Yes.
police or again, like different figures are able to do. And
Yes.
even within in the Muslim context, in terms of the war on terror, for example, and in terms of that, how that has affected the lives of Muslims on the daily. I mean, even for me, for example, with my dad, anytime he travels, it's something that you always kind of have to be on your toes, and
Yes.
how this affects people's everyday lives.
Yes.
And yet we don't question when, for example, a state actor is able to detain you for 4 or 5 hours, or
Yes.
put somebody in prison without charge, or whatever it may be.
Yes.
The last
Yes.
question I wanted to ask you, inshallah, before we close it out, and I think this is a question that's important, one of reflexivity, which is, why do Muslims and Muslim organizations like MAS, why must they support the Black Lives Matter movement?
Because they're Muslims, and it has to do with justice. We have to stand with justice. We have to stand with the oppressed. Remember that that meeting that the Prophet, peace be upon him, before he became a prophet, someone helped me with the name of the meeting, that he participated in a meeting that had to do with that if anybody was oppressed, right, or being dealt with unjustly, that everyone would help the oppressed. And the Prophet said, peace be upon him, I would participate in that meeting as a prophet. I would participate in that meeting, right? So we have to stand with the oppressed. We have to identify with the oppressed. We have to stand for justice, right? And on top of that, these are the people, Black folks, who are really the first allies of Muslims. If we're talking about strategic alliances, right? You're talking about a people, as I said earlier, whose most influential leaders were Muslims. And so these are natural allies. And Malcolm talked about that for African Americans on an international level, our natural allies is the Muslim world. Our natural allies is the Muslim world. That's what Malcolm advocated. You know what I'm saying? And so this is a natural alliance. It's a natural alliance. And it's about justice.
Inshallah, I wanted to actually close it out with a very inspiring quote that I think we should all reflect on before we close out, inshallah, Surah Al-Asr, which is from a journalist. His name is Chris Hedges, and
Yes,
essentially
yes.
people ask him, they ask him this question, which is like what keeps you going? Like, your job is essentially to document and to follow different forms of tragedy, different forms of oppression around the world. And what is it? What is it that keeps you going? And essentially, he responds that it's anger, and he says examples. It's anger, having spent months of my life in Gaza. It's anger at seeing the conditions of neighborhoods in different parts of the ghetto. And he gives all these examples, and then he has this line, which says, despair comes when the oppressed are an abstraction, and you can never allow the oppressed to become an abstraction. That these are real lives, real communities, and essentially that sustained rage comes from, one, again, situating it within history, and then two, being in touch, not being out of touch from the movement, from the struggle, and inshallah, being sincere and consistent in being relevant, not only when the waves, there are moments when it rises and moments when
Exactly.
it wanes,
Exactly.
but it's important for us to keep a steady stroke, throughout all of
Yes.
it,
Yes.
and not to forget. And I think that's why it was very important to have specifically reflections on the George Floyd's protest, because we don't want it to be now a remnant of the past, that
Yes.
that now we move forward. This is ongoing, this is continuing, and we must not
Yes.
let it be in the outskirts of our memory. Rather, it is an immediate and urgent social justice struggle, and it is an amana, it is a responsibility on each of us, ethically, morally, as Muslims, and as those that are committed to establishing justice, establishing righteousness, and inshallah, removing al-batil, removing falsehood and oppression of all forms. So
Exactly.
with that, I just wanted to say Jazakumullah khairan to everyone that tuned in today. Inshallah, we will have a screening of the Black Power mixtape. It's a documentary on Sunday. I'm sorry, a discussion, not a screening. I shared the link for those of you that are interested and that have registered. Inshallah, I'll send it again. Watch it and join us. We're going to have a discussion, inshallah, about that. And then next week, we're going to continue the second episode of George Floyd protests reflections. And Imam Malik Ali is very humble, mashallah, but he's been part of this story. He's been on the ground and continues to be doing work in the community, mashallah, behind the scenes. And I want to thank him for all that is known to the people and all that is not known, for being a steady pillar for us amidst all of this that is still grounded, mashallah, in the movement and in the important work that needs to be done. With that, I ask you, inshallah, if you can close us out with dua and Surah Al-Asr.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر آمين. جزاك الله خير everyone. جزاك الله خير.
بارك الله فيك أستاذ. السلام عليكم.
جزاكم الله خيرا. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
وعليكم السلام.
السلام عليكم. السلام عليكم.